Let's use some analogies to try to understand changes in prices. So focusing on the rate of change is critical. So you should think of price changes like a moving car. I emphasize the word moving car because the focus is not on the destination, but rather on the direction and speed of the automobile. And that's what we talk about with inflation. We want to focus on the direction of price changes, up or down, and the rate of the change. So here we see a graphic of a car, right? So the direction is where the car is pointed. So in this case, it's pointed forward. So it's moving forward. That's one description. And the other one is the speed. In this case, it's moving at 50 miles per hour. So when it's moving forward, prices are rising. When it's in reverse, prices are falling. So the direction of the car is analogous to changing prices. If the car is moving forward, then prices are rising. And if the car is moving in reverse, then prices are falling. If the car is moving forward at a constant speed, let's say 50 miles an hour, then that's like saying the inflation rate is at a constant rate. Let's say 2% every single year. So in other words, the rate of inflation is not changing. It's constant at 2%. Prices are going up. Even though there's a 0% change in inflation rate is not changing, it's just constant. In this scenario, the year-to-year change in the actual inflation rate is 0%. Now, if the car slows from 50 miles per hour to 30 miles per hour, it's still moving forward, but at a slower rate. This is the change in the rate of speed. This is the situation described in the headline in the last video. Prices were still rising, but at a slower rate. This is what we call disinflation. Finally, if the driver stops the car and puts it in reverse, that's a change in direction. Then this is like the average price actually falling, and that's deflation. So if the month-to-month inflation rate is negative, let's say minus 2% per month, then on average, goods and services are less expensive. Again, this is called deflation. So relative price is the price of one good in comparison with the price of other goods. A general inflation may prevent relative prices from reallocating resources in the economy. Although inflation makes some people worse off, it makes some people better off. So when you think about it, inflation to a certain degree is neither good nor bad. It all depends upon which side of the transaction you are. If you are on the buying side, inflation is not so good because that means you're paying a higher price. But if you're on the selling side, it means it's good because you get a higher price. So price changes are the most familiar effect of inflation. The effect on economic welfare is also shown in the difference between nominal and real income. Now these are very common terms of economics, nominal and real. Nominal income is the amount of money you receive in a given time period, measured in current dollars. A nice way of thinking about this is the number on the bill that you have in your hand. So let me just draw a little picture to explain this. So this is a dollar bill. So let's say this is a $100 bill. So this number is the nominal amount for that unit of currency, $100. And so if you got paid a $100 bill, your nominal income is $100. Now, real income is measured in constant dollars. So in other words, real income is based upon what this $100 buys you. If this $100 buys you more each year, in other words, you could take a $100 bill to a grocery store. If you get you could take this $100 to a grocery store, and if you get more groceries for your $100, that's another way of saying your real income has increased. So real income has to do with purchasing power. Nominal income simply has to do with the number of currency units that you have. So there are two basic lessons about inflation. Not all prices rise at the same rate during inflation, and not everybody suffers equally from inflation. So here's a good example. Here's some price changes in 2016. So train fares went up by 7.4% in that year, but bananas, on the other hand, fell by 1% on average. So think about this. If all you buy are bananas, you saw deflation in terms of what you were buying. If you spend most of your money on train fares, you saw a rapid increase in inflation. So how inflation affects you depends upon your spending habits. If you buy things that happen to go up in prices, like over here, then inflation is negatively impacting you. But if you buy things where the prices have actually fallen, that means your money is going further, and inflation is not harming you at all. It's actually it's deflation, therefore you're better off. So what about income effects? Even if all prices rise at the same rate, inflation would still redistribute income. The redistributive effects originate both in the expenditures, or in other words, spending, and income patterns. What looks like a price to a buyer looks like an income to a seller. So if prices are rising, incomes must be rising too. So in other words, if there's inflation, somebody's making more money. So when you talk about inflation, inflation helps those people who sell or produce a good that's rising in price, and it hurts those who have to buy those goods and services. So here we see how wages and prices have gone up over time, and you could see that wages have outpaced prices, and this gap is mainly due to a rise in worker productivity. So if workers are more productive, that's when you could see wages rising faster than prices. And this is another way of saying that on average, workers are better off because their money is going further because they're getting a bigger wage increase than the price increase. So wages, again, like I said before, wages rise faster than prices when productivity increases, and more slowly when non-wage costs increase. Now finally, there are some what we call wealth effects. Winners and losers from inflation depend upon the form of wealth you own. For example, are you fully invested in a 401k? That means you own a lot of stock. And stocks are a type of asset which accumulate into wealth. If you have all of your money invested in gold, that's another type of asset. You lose when inflation reduces the real value of your wealth. So take a look at this. Between 1991 and 2001, if you invested all of your money in stocks, you saw the value of your wealth increase by 250%. But what if you invested all of your money in collective stamps? Well, you would see the value of your wealth actually decline. So how asset inflation affects you, it all depends upon how you have invested your wealth. So inflation acts like a tax, taking income or wealth from one group and giving it to others. The redistributive mechanics of inflation includes both price effects, income effects, and wealth effects. So inflation can alter the rate and mix of output by changing consumption, work, savings, investment, and trade behavior. Now think about this. If the price of a good is going up rapidly, you would think that the economy would switch and produce more of that good. Because if you're a producer and you see that there's a product out there that is going up in price, that simply means it's more attractive to produce it. So can you see how when prices go up, it changes production and it will change your spending? If the price of meat goes up, there are people who are going to who will basically buy less of it and buy more of another good that's not going up as much in price. So that's another way of saying how inflation is affecting spending habits. So inflation changes behavior. It also can increase uncertainty in the economy. So people tend to shorten their time horizons in the face of inflation uncertainties. Time horizons are shortened as people attempt to spend money before it loses their value. So in other words, if inflation is going up rapidly, you need to spend your money as quickly as possible, because if you hold money under, let's say, underneath your mattress, that money is going to buy you less in the future because prices are going up. So people do not invest in the long term when there's rapid increases in inflation. It also increases speculation. Few people will encourage in production if it's easy to make speculative profits. Such speculation may fuel hyperinflation. So if you think something is going up in value, you may want to invest in that production or product simply to turn a quick profit. A good example would be housing. If housing prices are going up, which we've experienced in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, what people do is they buy a home, not to live in it, simply to flip it and sell it to somebody else for a profit. Now, can you see if a lot of people are buying a second or third home simply for investment purposes, how that could drive demand for homes, which would increase the price for homes? So you could see how speculation drives inflation. So again, like we said in the first video, during Germany, they experienced hyperinflation during the end of World War I. Workers were paid 2 to 3 times a day so that they could buy goods in the morning before prices increased in the afternoon. That's a very good example of shortened time horizons. So let's look at the United States over time. So here's a brief period where I look at basically the late 1990s to the late 2000s. And as you can see here, on average, prices rose 2.5% every year. And you could see the high point was about 4%, and the low point was about 1%. And so that's a rather narrow band for inflation to be traveling. So in other words, the inflation rate in the late 90s and early 2000s was considered to be low and stable. Now let's contrast that with the 1970s. Here, the blue line right here is the 1970s inflation rate. And you could see the high point was at 12%, and that the low point was at about 3%. So that's a wider range of variation. And the average inflation rate for that time was about 7.7%. So the average rate of inflation was a lot higher. So in the 70s, inflation was volatile and it was relatively high compared to the late 90s and early 2000s. So there is ample evidence that there are few substantive costs associated with moderate inflation. So in other words, when inflation is low and stable, it doesn't really affect the economy that much. And the reason why is because if inflation is predictable, you could protect yourself from it. For example, what if you negotiate a wage increase with your employer that matches the rate of inflation? Well, that means you've protected your purchasing power of your income. And so this is why the Federal Reserve and which is the guardian of against inflation, does not have a 0% inflation target. In other words, we don't want inflation to go to zero. All we want is inflation to be relatively low and stable in order for it to be neutral. So what we're going to do is we're going to be talking about different types of inflation in our next video.